In a corner of space where common sense went to die, humanity had established yet another outpost that would make even the most optimistic insurance adjuster weep openly. Kepler 442b stood as a testament to human optimism, or perhaps stupidity. The line between the two had become increasingly blurred in galactic academic circles. The planet possessed all the charm of a frozen wasteland with delusions of grandeur. Temperatures hovered at a balmy negative 40 degrees Celsius on what locals laughingly called warm days, while the weather patterns seemed designed by a committee of sadistic meteorologists. The indigenous wildlife had evolved with one clear directive: make visitors regret their life choices, preferably before they had time to write home about it. Against this backdrop of cosmic hostility, humanity had erected what they optimistically termed a research facility. The structure resembled nothing so much as a collection of metallic boxes that had survived a particularly vindictive game of interstellar Jenga. Prefabricated modules clung to each other through a combination of industrial-grade fasteners, human stubbornness, and what appeared to be wishful thinking. The entire complex hummed with the constant effort of keeping its inhabitants marginally less frozen than the landscape outside. Inside this monument to human persistence, the daily routine had achieved a sort of grim poetry. Every morning began with the ritual checking of life support systems, followed by the equally important ceremony of confirming that yes, it was still impossibly cold outside, and no, the weather had not improved overnight. The researchers moved through their duties with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that carelessness was just another word for becoming an interesting fossil. The protagonist of this particular exercise in cosmic irony had spent the better part of 3 months perfecting the art of not dying on a planet that seemed personally offended by warm-blooded life. She navigated the research station with the careful precision of someone who had learned to respect every surface, every system, and every moment of apparent safety. Her work focused on atmospheric composition studies, which was a polite way of saying she regularly ventured outside to collect samples of air that could freeze solid if it tried hard enough. On this particular morning, the universe had apparently decided that routine was becoming too comfortable. The atmospheric sampling equipment, a device that had functioned reliably for exactly 87 days, chose this moment to develop what technicians would later describe as a catastrophic personality disorder. The malfunction occurred precisely as she stood at the edge of a ravine that the survey team had optimistically labelled as mostly stable geological feature number 7. The equipment failure began as a simple calibration error. The sampling probe, instead of extending its normal 2 meters, decided to explore its full extension capability with the enthusiasm of a mechanical overachiever. The sudden shift in weight distribution created what physicists call a leverage situation, and what everyone else calls, oh no, not like this. The laws of physics, which had maintained their usual indifference to human plans, asserted themselves with characteristic efficiency. The probe's unexpected extension pulled her forward, and the allegedly stable geological feature revealed its true nature as a slippery slope with commitment issues. Gravity, that most reliable of universal constants, wasted no time in demonstrating why it had earned its reputation as the galaxy's most consistent performer. The fall began with the sort of slow-motion clarity that emergency situations often provide. She had enough time to register the irony of her predicament, catalogue the various ways this could end poorly, and experience a brief moment of professional curiosity about whether her descent would provide useful data about the ravine's geological composition. The sampling equipment, having caused the problem in the first place, accompanied her on the journey with what seemed like spiteful enthusiasm. The ravine walls rushed past with geological layers that told the story of millions of years of planetary history, each stratum a chapter in a very long book about ice, more ice, and occasionally different types of ice. Her emergency beacon, designed to activate upon impact, remained optimistically silent as she continued her unplanned survey of the local geography from an increasingly intimate perspective. The landing came with all the grace and dignity that gravity typically afforded to unexpected vertical expeditions. The snow at the bottom of the ravine received her with the sort of enthusiastic embrace that left very little room for breathing, while the sampling equipment landed nearby with a series of mechanical complaints that suggested its warranty had just become a moot point. As she lay at the bottom of the ravine, inventory of her situation revealed what emergency training manuals typically described as suboptimal circumstances. Her left ankle had developed a creative interpretation of its normal range of motion. Her emergency beacon had apparently decided that this was an excellent time for a nap, and the sampling equipment lay scattered around her like the components of a very expensive abstract sculpture. The blizzard, which had been threatening all morning with the sort of meteorological passive aggression that characterized the planet's weather patterns, chose this moment to make good on its promises. The wind picked up with the enthusiasm of a natural phenomenon that had been looking forward to this particular opportunity all day. Snow began falling with the kind of determination that suggested it had personal grievances against visibility and generally favourable atmospheric conditions. As the storm intensified, the temperature began its familiar descent toward values that made liquid nitrogen feel inadequately ambitious. The ravine walls, which had seemed merely steep during her descent, now loomed overhead like the walls of a very deep, very cold, and increasingly white tomb. The research station, a mere 100 metres away at surface level, might as well have been on the other side of the galaxy for all the good it did her current circumstances. The emergency protocols, memorized through countless drills and safety briefings, seemed suddenly theoretical when applied to a situation involving a malfunctioning beacon, an injured ankle, and weather conditions that approached the planet's personal best for inhospitability. As the blizzard settled into what appeared to be a long-term commitment to making her day progressively worse, she had ample time to reflect on the curious human tendency to find themselves in situations that would make other species question the entire concept of exploration. The creature that discovered her possessed all the evolutionary advantages that 3 million years of natural selection could provide, plus several extras that seemed designed specifically to make other life forms reconsider their career choices. Standing nearly 4 meters at the shoulder, with muscles that rippled beneath a coat of adaptive fur so dense it could double as body armor, it represented the planet's most successful attempt at creating the perfect killing machine. Its species had earned their position at the top of the food chain through a combination of superior intellect, devastating physical capabilities, and an approach to problem solving that generally involved making problems cease to exist in the most efficient way possible. The creature's senses could detect a heartbeat from half a kilometre away, track scent trails through blizzards that would confuse orbital satellites, and identify the chemical composition of fear from the subtle changes in prey behaviour. These same enhanced senses now presented it with a puzzle that violated approximately everything it understood about the natural order. The strange bipedal creature at the bottom of the ravine registered as warm-blooded, which should have immediately classified it as either food or competition. However, several factors complicated this normally straightforward assessment. First, the thing was pathetically small, barely reaching what the creature would consider ankle height. Second, it possessed no visible weapons, claws, fangs, or any other equipment that might justify its presence in a hostile environment. Third, and most perplexing, it seemed to be actively losing its body heat at a rate that suggested either a serious malfunction or a particularly elaborate form of suicide. The creature's neural pathways, shaped by millions of years of predatory evolution, struggled to process this information. Its ancestors had faced countless variations of prey species, each with their own survival strategies. Some relied on speed, others circulatory systems. The second sensation was considerably more alarming. She was completely encased in what felt like the galaxy's most luxurious fur coat, except that fur coats typically didn't come with their own respiratory patterns and subtle muscle movements. The material covering her possessed a density and sophistication that made military-grade thermal protection look like tissue paper, and it seemed to be actively adjusting its properties in response to her body temperature. Her attempts to process this information were interrupted by the discovery of sensation number 3. Something very large, very much alive, and very obviously not human, was sitting approximately 2 meters away, making soft sounds that her oxygen-deprived brain interpreted as either advanced alien poetry or the biological equivalent of chattering teeth. The creature responsible for her current state of not being frozen solid was clearly suffering from its own version of thermal distress. Without its magnificent coat, it had been reduced to a shivering mass of muscle and exposed skin that seemed to be conducting heat away from its body with the efficiency of a planetary cooling system. Its breathing had taken on the rapid, shallow pattern of a biological system working overtime to maintain basic functions, while its massive frame had contracted into the smallest possible configuration. The irony of the situation registered through her hypothermia-induced mental fog with crystalline clarity. She had been rescued from freezing to death by a creature that was now freezing to death, because it had rescued her from freezing to death. The circular logic of this arrangement seemed to encapsulate everything that made interspecies relations so endlessly complicated. Her first attempt at communication involved sitting up, which proved to be an ambitious undertaking, given that her body had apparently forgotten how to perform basic motor functions. The movement produced a cascade of small sounds from the alien fur, which immediately triggered a response from the creature. Its head turned toward her with movements that managed to convey both alertness and the sort of bone-deep weariness that comes from voluntary exposure to unsurvivable weather conditions. Eye contact, when it came, proved to be an educational experience in the relativity of perspective. The creature's eyes were approximately the size of dinner plates and possessed a depth of intelligence that made her previous assumptions about local wildlife seem embarrassingly provincial. These were not the eyes of a simple predator operating on instinct. They belonged to a being capable of complex reasoning, emotional processing, and apparently the sort of existential confusion that came with acting against every survival instinct evolution had provided. Communication attempts began with the sort of tentative gestures that characterized first contact scenarios throughout galactic history. She raised one hand in what shivering form, and, with movements that combined surprising gentleness with obvious bewilderment at its own actions, began the process of removing its own winter coat. The adaptive fur that covered its body represented millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Each hair follicle could adjust its density, thermal properties, and insulation capabilities in response to environmental conditions. The coat could regulate the creature's body temperature across a range that extended from the planet's summer highs to winter lows that would freeze most atmospheric gases. Removing it in current weather conditions was, by any reasonable biological standard, an act of species-level stupidity. The creature performed this act of biological impossibility with the sort of methodical determination that suggested its decision-making processes had experienced a complete systems failure. Layer by layer, it carefully transferred sections of its coat to the motionless biped, covering the strange creature in fur that still retained the warmth of its original owner. As the last section of adaptive fur settled over the bipedal form, the creature stepped back to observe its handiwork. The biped was now completely enclosed in a cocoon of the galaxy's most sophisticated thermal regulation system, while the creature itself stood exposed to environmental conditions that its species had specifically evolved to avoid. The first wave of cold hit the creature's newly exposed skin with the enthusiasm of a natural phenomenon that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Its internal temperature regulation systems, suddenly deprived of their primary insulation, began working overtime to maintain core body heat. The creature's enhanced senses, now registering its own rapidly dropping surface temperature, sent increasingly urgent signals to its brain about the need to seek shelter or reclaim its protective coating. Instead, the creature settled onto the snow-covered ground nearby, wrapping its now vulnerable form into the tightest ball its anatomy would permit. Its breath began to fog in the frigid air as it committed to the most irrational act in its species' evolutionary history. Voluntary hypothermia in service of keeping a strange, small, apparently helpless biped from freezing to death. The universe, which had witnessed countless examples of predator behavior over billions of years of biological development, added this moment to its growing collection of things that probably shouldn't happen, but definitely just did. Consciousness returned with all the subtlety of a malfunctioning heating system, bringing with it the sort of awareness that suggested her brain had been temporarily outsourced to someone else's management. The first sensation to register was warmth, which seemed so fundamentally wrong given her circumstances that she briefly wondered if hypothermia had progressed to the hallucinatory stage, where dying people imagined tropical beaches and functioning circulatory systems. The second sensation was considerably more alarming. She was completely encased in what felt like the galaxy's most luxurious fur coat, except that fur coats typically didn't come with their own respiratory patterns and subtle muscle movements. The material covering her possessed a density and sophistication that made military-grade thermal protection look like tissue paper, and it seemed to be actively adjusting its properties in response to her body temperature. Her attempts to process this information were interrupted by the discovery of sensation number 3, something very large, very much alive, and very obviously not human, was sitting approximately 2 meters away, making soft sounds that her oxygen-deprived brain interpreted as either advanced alien poetry or the biological equivalent of chattering teeth. The creature responsible for her current state of not being frozen solid was clearly suffering from its own version of thermal distress. Without its magnificent coat, it had been reduced to a shivering mass of muscle and exposed skin that seemed to be conducting heat away from its body with the efficiency of a planetary cooling system. Its breathing had taken on the rapid, shallow pattern of a biological system working overtime to maintain basic functions, while its massive frame had contracted into the smallest possible configuration. The irony of the situation registered through her hypothermia-induced mental fog with crystalline clarity. She had been rescued from freezing to death by a creature that was now freezing to death, because it had rescued her from freezing to death. The circular logic of this arrangement seemed to encapsulate everything that made interspecies relations so endlessly complicated. Her first attempt at communication involved sitting up, which proved to be an ambitious undertaking, given that her body had apparently forgotten how to perform basic motor functions. The movement produced a cascade of small sounds from the alien fur, which immediately triggered a response from the creature. Its head turned toward her with movements that managed to convey both alertness and the sort of bone-deep weariness that comes from voluntary exposure to unsurvivable weather conditions. Eye contact, when it came, proved to be an educational experience in the relativity of perspective. The creature's eyes were approximately the size of dinner plates and possessed a depth of intelligence that made her previous assumptions about local wildlife seem embarrassingly provincial. These were not the eyes of a simple predator operating on instinct. They belonged to a being capable of complex reasoning, emotional processing, and apparently the sort of existential confusion that came with acting against every survival instinct evolution had provided. Communication attempts began with the sort of tentative gestures that characterized first contact scenarios throughout galactic history. She raised one hand in what she hoped was a universally non-threatening gesture, while the creature responded with a series of low vocalizations that seemed to combine greeting, inquiry, and possibly commentary on the absurdity of their shared predicament. The language barrier proved to be less of a barrier and more of a complete absence of common ground. Her attempts to convey gratitude through vocal means produced sounds that made the creature tilt its massive head with what appeared to be polite confusion. Its responses, delivered in frequencies that ranged from subsonic rumbles to harmonics that made her teeth ache, seemed equally incomprehensible to her admittedly limited xenolinguistic capabilities. Gesture-based communication proved marginally more successful, though success was a relative term when applied to conversations between species that had evolved on different planets with entirely different approaches to expressing basic concepts. Her pointing at the fur coat and then at the creature produced a response that might have been acknowledgement, embarrassment, or possibly commentary on human intelligence levels. The creature's attempts to communicate involved movements of its massive head, subtle changes in vocalization patterns, and what appeared to be a growing sense of frustration with the limitations of impromptu interspecies diplomacy. Its gestures possessed a precision that suggested high intelligence, but the meaning behind them remained as impenetrable as the mathematical principles governing faster-than-light travel. As the conversation continued to generate more confusion than understanding, she became increasingly aware of the creature's deteriorating condition. Its shivering had intensified to the point where its massive frame was visibly vibrating, while its breathing had taken on the sort of rhythm that suggested biological systems operating well beyond their normal parameters. The realization that the creature was suffering for her benefit triggered a response that bypassed rational thought entirely. Despite her injured ankle and general state of physical dysfunction, she began attempting to remove portions of the alien fur with the intention of returning them to their original owner. This proved to be more complicated than anticipated, as the coat seemed designed to resist easy removal, and her fine motor control remained questionable at best. Her efforts to share the thermal protection produced immediate and vociferous objections from the creature. Its vocalizations increased in both volume and frequency, while its gestures became increasingly emphatic in what appeared to be alien for absolutely not. The creature's insistence on maintaining her exclusive access to the life-saving fur coat seemed to violate every principle of logical resource distribution. The ensuing argument, conducted entirely through gesture and vocalization patterns that neither participant fully understood, represented a new high point in interspecies misunderstanding. She attempted to explain, through increasingly animated hand movements, that sharing the coat was the only logical solution, while the creature responded with what could only be described as stubborn refusal delivered in frequencies that made nearby snow crystals rearrange themselves. The debate was interrupted by a sound that neither participant had been expecting: the distinctive whine of approaching hover vehicles, accompanied by the sort of engine noise that suggested human technology operating in conditions it had never been designed to handle. The rescue beacon, having apparently recovered from its earlier bout of electronic depression, had finally decided to fulfill its primary function at the most dramatically inconvenient moment possible. The rescue team's arrival could only be described as aggressively competent, descending into the ravine with all the subtlety of a controlled avalanche. 3 humans in environmental suits rappelled down the ice-covered walls while maintaining commentary on equipment performance and the questionable life choices that had led to this emergency response scenario. The scene at the bottom challenged fundamental assumptions about predator-prey relationships and survival behaviour. Their missing colleague sat wrapped in what appeared to be a fur coat of impossible sophistication, while a creature that typically appeared in expedition nightmares huddled nearby in voluntary hypothermia that violated every known principle of survival behaviour. The team leader spent several seconds staring at the tableau before training reasserted itself over cosmic bewilderment. The medical assessment came first. Both the human and creature showed signs of exposure, though the human's condition appeared significantly better than theoretical models suggested possible given the environmental conditions and elapsed time. The creature's condition proved more difficult to assess, largely because their medical training had focused on human physiology rather than apex predators who had apparently decided to embrace pacifism. Its massive frame continued to shiver with mechanical regularity, while its breathing patterns suggested a biological system operating beyond normal parameters, but maintaining basic functions through stubborn determination. Documentation of the scene became priority, partly for scientific purposes, and partly because no one was going to believe the mission report without evidence. The recording equipment captured the creature's massive size, its distressed condition, the sophisticated thermal properties of the fur coat, and most importantly, its complete lack of aggressive behaviour toward the humans who had invaded its territory. The evacuation required diplomatic finesse that had never appeared in any emergency response manual. The creature's reluctance to leave the human presented logistical challenges ranging from touching to potentially fatal. Its vocalizations during the rescue seemed to combine concern, confusion, and possibly instructions for thermal regulation techniques. The human's insistence on ensuring the creature's welfare before accepting evacuation created complications that pushed the team's problem-solving capabilities into uncharted territory. Her attempts to return portions of the fur coat met with stubborn resistance, while the creature's gestures became increasingly emphatic about maintaining her exclusive access to its thermal protection. The resolution came through a combination of human ingenuity and the sort of improvised engineering that had made the species famous throughout the galaxy for creative solutions to impossible problems. The team's portable heater, originally intended for equipment maintenance, was reconfigured to provide direct thermal support for the creature while they prepared the human for transport. The creature's reaction to artificial heat sources provided yet another data point in what was rapidly becoming the galaxy's most perplexing xenobiological case study. Instead of the typical territorial response to unknown technology, it demonstrated what could only be described as grateful acceptance, settling closer to the heating unit with obvious relief while maintaining visual contact with the human throughout the evacuation process. The journey back to the research station became a procession of firsts. The first recorded instance of an apex predator providing life support to a different species. The first documented case of voluntary hypothermia in service of interspecies altruism. And the first time a rescue team had needed to coordinate extraction procedures with a creature that had previously been classified as extremely hostile to human presence. The scientific documentation process began before they reached the station's medical facility. The creature's behaviour required immediate analysis by xenobiological experts, while the thermal properties of its adaptive fur demanded examination by materials scientists who had assumed such sophisticated biological engineering was purely theoretical. The galactic scientific community's response oscillated between fascination and complete rejection of the data as impossible. The behavioural patterns violated established theories about predator psychology, evolutionary imperatives, and interspecies interactions. Several xenobiological journals initially refused to consider the research, citing concerns about data fabrication. The creature's eventual return to the wild occurred 3 days later, after monitoring confirmed its full recovery. Its departure was observed and documented, but the lasting effects of its encounter with humanity remained subjects of ongoing speculation. The human's recovery proceeded according to standard protocols, though her insistence on continuing atmospheric sampling work in the same area suggested the experience had done nothing to diminish her enthusiasm for potentially hazardous scientific endeavours. Her research paper became required, reading in xenobiological curricula across known space. The broader implications resonated throughout galactic academic circles with intellectual disruption that typically accompanied paradigm shifts. If humanity could inspire altruistic behaviour in apex predators through nothing more than their presence and apparent helplessness, what did this suggest about the species' broader effects on galactic ecosystem dynamics? The Galactic Council's response involved creating an entirely new classification system for behavioural anomalies associated with human contact. The official designation, Human-Induced Altruistic Response Syndrome, became a recognised phenomenon requiring special consideration in research involving human presence in established ecosystems. The universe, which had spent billions of years perfecting the elegant balance between predator and prey relationships, added this incident to its growing collection of evidence that humanity's greatest talent lay not in their technology, resilience, or adaptability, but in their remarkable ability to make every other species in the galaxy just as irrationally selfless as they were,